Hi, welcome to Rontime. Thank you for inviting me into your viewing space, wherever that may be. It's 17 of October 2014. Amazingly enough, on this day in history, I don't really know what else happened, but that's okay. As you can see, I'm sitting next to a reflective pond in the mountains of Sikkim on a trail from Nepal to Kanchenjunga. This was a Tibetan village, and a Tibetan medicine man there practiced Tibetan ancient herbal medicine on me as I was suffering badly from altitude sickness from climbing K2 and hallucinating and fevers and chills and just about freaking out of my skin. Anyway, while I stayed there, I also fixed the batteries, recharged batteries, and fixed the solar lighting that allowed yak trains to go through the village at night carrying climbing gear towards the Everest Base Camp and K2, including the family of the woman who owned the yaks that carried our gear for our climb of Kanchenjunga. Anyway, it's a really beautiful place. It was quite serene, and it was nice recovering there. The people were just so friendly and so beautiful. It's hard to believe that the Chinese people call them devils and hold the Dalai Lama as a terrorist attempting to overthrow the government of China. Interesting, a man wins the Nobel Peace Prize and the Chinese put him on their terrorist list. But the Chinese have their own way of viewing the world. They've been a very powerful nation for a long time in their own quiet ways, very rarely venturing out to try to conquer any space or territory until recently under communism. So today here we sit in what's supposed to be a democracy, the United States of America, and we've achieved a new high standard for the United States. We are 5 and 25. And what I mean by 5 and 25 is that we are 5% now of the world's population, and yet we incarcerate 25% of the world's prisoners. And you would expect from listening to all the discussion about law and order and peaceful demonstration and the ability to assemble and to govern through democracy, we have turned that into a for-profit prison system that now incarcerates 25% of the people incarcerated on Earth. And so I'm hoping once again that the president will review the proclamation that I drafted for him called Harry Anslinger Day, which calls for the legalization of hemp and cannabis and commercialization of both of them as products to turn us towards a sustainable future with a renewable energy policy and an intelligent policy towards drugs. And if in fact he were to sign that before the Attorney General leaves office, then the first black president of the United States and the first black Attorney General would have the privilege of straightening out a lie that was propagated in 1937 in the Marijuana Tax Act hearings before the Congress of the United States, where Harry Anslinger lied to the Congress and failed to allow testimony from the doctors who represented the American Medical Association there. And when I stopped to think about that and have any discussions about that with my 95-year-old mother, what that means is that most of her lifetime, the federal government has propagated and propped up a lie that cannabis causes causes darkies to believe they're good enough to dance with white women. And that is the congressional testimony of Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1937, before the Congress of the United States under hearings for the Marijuana Tax Act. You'll notice that under President Nixon and Reagan, the war on drugs was escalated because of Rockefeller mandatory sentencing, etc., to the point now where you can see why 5% of the world's population houses 25% of the world's incarcerated bodies. And it's a real shame that we have stooped in the Department of Justice to such a low level of truth all the way up the line, from the hearings that classified it to the Congress that failed to halt the hearings and demand open data, open reference to data, rather than this chairman's biased and bigoted attitude establishing a way to keep young black men in communities all over America in jail for nonviolent crime, possession of marijuana. 750,000 people were arrested last year and also the year before since I first sent the draft proclamation to the President of the United States in 2012. Had he enacted this proclamation at that time, 1.5 million families across the United States would not suffer the devastating consequences of a series of punishments that far outweigh the crime. Even possession of a $20 bag of marijuana can end you with a $1,450 fine from the city of Tucson for possession in a vehicle, and have the vehicle impounded while you go to jail for 6 months and work 8 hours a day for the Koch brothers. Because the Koch brothers have managed over years and years to have their industries insert labor-intensive factories into the for-profit prisons that they talked the states into taking on through crafty legislation and the use of an organization called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which wrote the legislation that created these for-profit prisons state by state, and in the case of Arizona, even provided shares to the governor, Jan Brewer, as part of the process of having the state guarantee a 90% occupancy so that the profitability of these prisons was guaranteed. Now, if they weren't 90% occupied, then you and I, the taxpayer of the state of Arizona, have to pick up the difference. So, these for-profit prisons, where two of the richest billionaires in the United States have factories that make products that all sorts of people buy and use on the open market without any knowledge whatsoever that they've been manufactured in a for-profit prison facility. So, if you see any product that is made by the Koch brothers, please do not buy it. do not support them in any way, do not support the efforts to continue to grow in the state of Arizona even more for-profit prisons than now exist. As I said, we are 5 and 25, and there is no logical reason on earth for 5% of the world's population to have more than 5% of the world's prisoners. The fact that we have 5 times that is a direct indication of the color blindness of the justice system of the United States that puts 4 out of 5 incarcerations are persons of color. So that's why it's imperative that the Attorney General, Eric Holder, and the President of the United States and the Democratic Assistant, oh goodness, I have already forgotten his name, and that Nancy Pelosi, the chief Democratic in the House of Representatives, push the president now, having received another copy, updated, of the draft resolution, Harry Anslinger Day, which not only would make every April 20th a National Day of Gardening for hemp and cannabis clear across the United States without any federal interference from now on, it would also establish Truth and Reconciliation Councils where people who were prosecuted unfairly under these statutes have the full opportunity for restoration of their civil rights. And that means 5.5 million of them are going to get to vote as a result of the president signing this proclamation. Believe it or not, by signing this proclamation, President Obama would actually release from incarceration more young black males than were freed at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation by President Abraham Lincoln. Do you understand the significance of placing these people back in their own communities, back in their own homes, back in their own families, back in their own schools, so that then they get a fair shot at the American dream that includes democracy for persons of color without discrimination by the use of this very, very, very racist policy, making it illegal to possess cannabis. Now, the reason it's illegal to possess hemp or to produce or grow hemp in the United States, with the exception, I believe, of the state of Colorado, which had its first legal hemp harvest this past year, newspaper barons were afraid that hemp paper was going to put them at a disadvantage because it was stronger, cheaper, it grew 3 crops a year, and they had already invested millions of dollars in hundreds and thousands of acres of conifer forests that had a 30-year harvest cycle for them to print their newspapers. So they banded together and made the Congress declare hemp an illegal crop to produce in the United States of America, with the exception of Defense Department fields that are kept for strategic reserves of hemp to make housers for the U.S. Navy to restrain large ships at sea, or in port, I'm sorry. So, if those 2 plant species were legalized, then the President of the United States would free more young black men than Abraham Lincoln did. The economy would receive 2 brand new sources of renewable, sustainable crop economies. And we can replace drill, baby, drill with Grow Baby Grow. And because these two plants are unique in their biochemistry, they sequester out of the atmosphere 4 times more carbon than any other species of plant on Earth. And therefore, they ought to be put into very large-scale production to offset the carbon footprint that the United States has been pounding out ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, it's true these are very logical solutions that I'm suggesting, but they're certainly not going to be politically correct nor politically popular. First of all, it cuts out of the entire profit mode those people who currently hold stock and are shareholders in these for-profit prisons who have been making money off the misery of other human beings. Now, granted, you can look back to the Constitution itself and the framers of that document, many of whom were slave owners. So seems to be an American paradigm that we speak one democracy and practice another one called the economy of slavery. Now, the modern 21st century slavery includes the slavery involved when migrants attempting to get into the United States are actually kidnapped and put to work by gangs in various industries in cities throughout the United States, in everything from the sex trade to the importation, transportation of illegal substances and products that were brought into the United States without paying taxes or benefiting the United States in the normal way that trade occurs. So by taking this bold step, the president then also takes responsibility for all the treaties that we have through the United Nations, and some of them going all the way back to the formation of the League of Nations before the Second World War, that these countries were forced to accept our classification of cannabis as a Class 1 narcotic and our classification of hemp as a dangerous drug. And by clearing up those two very large white lies told by a white supremacist racist named Harry Anslinger, who was jealous of J. Edgar Hoover's position at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he wanted for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics to become a large and prestigious organization, knowing that they needed a new enemy number one to replace alcohol as Prohibition ended and state by state rescinded the laws making it illegal to consume, produce, and therefore distribute and tax and serve alcohol. And as we know from current medical studies, the legalization, taxation of tobacco and alcohol are far more toxic and far more dangerous than the legalization, taxation of cannabis. The states of Washington and Colorado have reduced their deficits, have zeroed their court wait time. They have streamlined the process of law enforcement, and they've stopped wasting public resources doing a cops and robbers game that goes back to 1937 when my mom was still a teenager. And now at 95 years old, she doesn't agree with the current policies of the federal government and believes that it should be totally decriminalized and legalized for both medicinal and recreational use. And if it were taxed at an adequate rate, then it would make up for the kind of crazy deficits that we've run up, having these wars based on fictional characters and fictional problems in far-off lands where Sunnis and Shias and other sects of Muslims have been at war with each other and settling their differences through the use of violence since before we were a country. So, of course, it makes no sense to continue on a course where we think we're going to go over there and fix them all up. If you paid some attention to the United States and our policies here at home, this would be a priority that would free more young black men than Lincoln during Emancipation Proclamation. So it behooves you, Mr. President, and it behooves you, Mr. Attorney General, to actually take action on this proclamation and move it from a draft to an actual presidential proclamation before Eric Holder leaves office as Attorney General of the United States. The timing is right. The states are there to support you. More and more legislators are realizing that the cost of the war on drugs in treasury and in blood is on our hands, that 70,000 people at least have disappeared or died in the cartel drug wars in Mexico because of our policies and our demand. So it's time to face the facts like Uruguay has and legalized it for recreational and medical use and established ways of licensing, taxing, and therefore benefiting the citizens of the nation. So I encourage you once again to review the draft document that would solve many of the problems that currently exist in the United States of America that make us not look like a democracy. The 5-25 ratio is completely out of balance, and it's time for you to use your law professor intelligence to analyze the draft proclamation, Harry Anslinger Day, and to sign it into law. And it's up to the Attorney General to see to it that the entire Department of Justice of the federal government of the United States of America stops playing this cops and robbers lie about cannabis. And as a result of that, I guarantee you that law enforcement in this country will be able to prevent the kinds of things like this sniper hiding in the woods, taking off police officers with long-range rifles. And you could actually put the resources of the police departments of the United States back into the communities where all these young black men and young brown men, Chicanos and black men, are going to be reunited with their families and their communities. And it's time for all of these communities to acknowledge that gardening is a very intelligent way to produce the goods, foods, services, and carbon sequestration we need to clean up the errors and omissions of our previous generation's way of doing business here on Earth. And as a result of planting large areas of hemp and sequestering 4 times more carbon than any other plant on Earth, we will take a responsible stance on global warming and climate change. So, that's kind of a mouthful, and I've challenged you to tell the truth and stand up and make up for the mistakes that have been passed on to my generation ever since 1937. So, on behalf of Rontime, I thank you for inviting me into your viewing space. Please look me up on YouTube under Ron Carswell, and have a nice day.